So on behalf of the Long U.S.-China Institute, I am Emily Baum, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Janet Chen. Dr. Chen is Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton University, where she specializes in the urban and social history of modern China. Her first book, Guilty of Indigence, The Urban Poor in China, was published by Princeton University Press in 2012. And it described in meticulous detail, as is characteristic of all of her works, how concepts of poverty changed over the course of the early 20th century from an accident of fate to evidence of moral failure and a problem that the state needed to solve. Her most recent book, which will be the subject of the talk today, is The Sounds of Mandarin, Learning to Speak a National Language in China and Taiwan, which was just published in July from Columbia University Press. And like all of her work, The Sounds of Mandarin is impeccably researched and cogently written, providing an unusually captivating account, including more than one episode of people getting into fistfights over the quest to achieve a national and mutually intelligible spoken language in China and Taiwan. If she wasn't already busy enough with her own research, teaching, and advising, which she does quite a lot of, Professor Chen is also currently completing the revised edition of the textbook, The Search for Modern China, which is a huge undertaking and a true service to the profession. So Professor Chen's talk today is called The Sounds of Mandarin, Learning to Speak a National Language in China and Taiwan, and please join me in welcoming her to UCI.
So much, Emily, for inviting me to Irvine, giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you about my work. Nice to see some old friends, meet some new ones. It's also a delight to return to Orange County. This is actually where I grew up, just down the 405 in Mission Viejo. I haven't been here in a really long time, though. Nothing looks familiar. Although I do remember University High. It was where our tribals in, all kinds of things. So the Sounds of Mandarin is a social history of the spoken national language of China and Taiwan over a 50-year period starting in the early 20th century. The original inspiration for this was Mao, and in particular this image of him standing atop Tiananmen Square proclaiming the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. So this is footage I had seen many times, I'm sure you have too. And I noticed this many years ago that I had very little recollection of actually ever hearing Mao's voice. I only had this vague impression. His speech is almost always muted, so if you're watching Chinese TV, it's superseded by the Chinese television announcer. If you're watching a documentary in English, there's usually a narrator with a BBC accent. So you never actually hear Mao giving this speech. So I went and found a copy of the original recording and listened to it. And I kind of realized, I kind of came up with a theory of why you don't hear it. It's because it's really hard to understand. That Hunan accent is something else. And so I wondered, well, by what definition could this be considered Mandarin? I also listened to recordings from Jiang Jieshi and Sun Zhongshan. And that was how I started poking around with this research while I was finishing my first book on urban poverty. So that research was about shanty towns and orphans and the incarceration of the poor, so it's a completely different subject, nothing to do with language. And language is a sprawling topic, some would say a really foolish choice for a second book. And if I had known how long it was going to take for me to finish this book, I probably wouldn't have gone down that rabbit hole. But it was an absorbing subject, which took me to a lot of unexpected places. I'm actually really glad I didn't write the sequel. I would have finished it quickly, but it would not, I think, have been nearly as interesting. So I spent quite a lot of time studying dictionaries, trying to excavate the sounds of pronunciation from written text. For those of you who love dictionaries, like you can come talk to me. It's like super nerding out, but it's really fun. And then I actually fumbled my way through the world of film, which I didn't really know anything about. And there I was trying to figure out how to translate sounds that are captured in film into written analysis. And as I'll talk a little bit about, I took a detour to Taiwan in the post-war period, and it took me a really long time to get to 1949, the point of inspiration that animated my interest in this subject. So one of the main goals in this book is to reconsider the conventional wisdom about China's national language by focusing on speech and from the vantage point of social history. So existing scholarship tends to portray the linguistic experiments of the 20th century as a series of language reforms, one after the other. It's a linear narrative. It starts with the decline of the Qing Empire at the turn of the century to the triumph of the Communist Party in 1949. And the standard language is in written form, a modern vernacular with simplified characters. And in spoken form, it's a unified Mandarin that arises out of the cacophony of dialects. And in general, the scholarship has privileged the written script over the spoken word, and so Mandarin in its spoken form is usually assumed to be either a coherent or pre-existing entity, or it's developing along this path that leads to linguistic unity. So the most influential historical source that articulates this view is Li Jingxi's An Outline History of the National Language Movement, first published in 1933. As it happened, Li was one of the chief protagonists of this history and also its most persuasive chronicler. So it's a pretty neat trick if you can pull it off. You get to basically write the history of what you did. This is an encyclopedic narrative, and in this he traced how the multiplicity of linguistic experiments starting in the late Qing came together to form this national language movement. Since the first edition appeared, it has been reprinted dozens of times. There was a new edition that appeared, that came out in 2011. It's a comprehensive source, and every generation of scholarship since the 1930s has relied heavily on it, sometimes exclusively. So you can actually find whole chapters of this plagiarized, almost verbatim, in sort of reference works and histories of Chinese language reform. The work is difficult to match in its comprehensive coverage, and until recently it was actually kind of hard to find the sources that Li referred to and used, because the footnotes are very sparse. So my first source was to first look for some of the original documents, so I didn't have to rely on Li's interpretation of them. And then I moved on to look for other kinds of sources. With the advent of sound technology in the early 20th century, there are some surviving phonograph recordings and radio broadcasts, sound films dating to the 1930s that give us the opportunity to actually hear the changing sounds of a language as it was being created in that process of formation. So conceptually, I approach Mandarin as a social and cultural process, not as an endpoint in this journey to linguistic unity. So in bringing the social history of the spoken national language into the picture, I drew on theories from sociolinguistics. So language acquisition and pedagogy provided helpful frameworks for actually analyzing the dynamics of linguistic change, and in focusing on the question of standardization as concept and practice, I was inspired by this classic book, Measures and Men by Witold Kula. So Kula defined a standard as an objective, immutable, and independent of human individuality. So he said to standardize, you have to be able to assess the degree of deviation. And the key here is the invariability in the unit of measurement. So the classic examples would be weights and measures. So the weight of a kilogram and the length of a meter in Irvine should be the same as a kilogram and a meter in Garden Grove, for example. So I use these ideas to think about linguistic standardization, and seeing that speech was a little different, because unlike a kilogram or a meter, the spectrum of variation in pronunciation is very difficult to measure. So the invariability in that measurement, in the unit of measurement, becomes a big problem. And as I found in the case of Mandarin, the spectrum of variation in speech existed in constant tension with the desire or the imperative to set the standard. So how you gauge the degree of standard or non-standardness and the meanings that people imparted to those measurements were highly contested. And in the early 20th century, the impetus for standards, for 标准, really was ubiquitous in Chinese discourse and practice across many fields. If you look in education, commercial and industrial pursuits, or government administration, there's a lot of discussion about the need to standardize. This is part of an impulse to rationalize society, improve efficiency, and increase productivity. And the thought was that if we could standardize, it's going to make everything a lot better. Now, in the attempt to standardize the national language, those who prioritize precision and accuracy in pronunciation insisted that everyone should conform to a fixed and ostensibly homogeneous ideal. On the other side of the argument, there were others who endorsed attitudes or more or less correct flexibility at the boundaries, or what they called a blue-green approach that's good enough for communication. And so you have people who really want everyone to speak precisely, and you have people who said, let's just see if we can communicate with each other. And so that becomes kind of two general camps. Another goal of the book, framed as social history, is to try to transcend elite viewpoints. But as in many arenas of historical research, elite dominance of the source base is very difficult to escape. So here I follow the adventures of a large cast of characters. So these are intellectuals, linguists, government officials, and I use their voluminous writings as the scaffolding for research. So they would be arguing about something, and I would kind of dig into those debates and try to figure out what it was that they were arguing about. And then I tried to move beyond their debates and follow the spoken national language to schools and to explore its sounds as features of urban life. I moved a little bit into rural areas to think about the possibilities and the limitations of standard speech, but that research is pretty hard to do because you're still relying on elite perspectives. And I was also interested in what happens to the standard language in time of war and migration. There's the legacy of the colonial language in Taiwan, and then what happens when everything is amped up by the mass campaigns of the 1950s. The aspirations of experts and government regimes to mold people into proper national or socialist subjects through speech are an essential part of the story. But I think the story is incomplete without searching for and paying attention to the moments when the people talked back. And doing so, I think, changes the trajectory of how we understand historical change in this realm. So rather than a march towards linguistic unity, I see speaking, learning, and teaching the national language as individual acts that were imbued with multiple and conflicting meanings beyond nationalism. In my scale of analysis, I move, probably for some people, too much between national horizons, regional factors, and individual concerns. I don't really try to give comprehensive coverage to the topics because that's just impossible. And so my strategy was to kind of zero in on moments of conflict and collision to examine how different modalities of the national language functioned. So sometimes it was an ideological package and a set of spoken norms. Sometimes it actually functioned as variable indices of class and social status. Sometimes it was the expression of individual commitments and priorities. Okay, so let me briefly mention the terms that are used to refer to the Chinese language. What we call Mandarin actually has a lot of different variations. And in my view, when we use just the translated term Mandarin, it obscures some of these processes that were at work in their formation. It's probably familiar to lots of people in this room, so I won't belabor this. English rendering comes from the name for Chinese officials, right, the mandarins. And historically, this referred to the spoken language of officialdom, called Guanhua. And Guanhua lives on into the 1960s. People are still talking about Guanhua. Now, that was not standardized, had many regional variants, but by all accounts, Guanhua constituted a loose lingua franca that officials, traveling merchants, or people who needed to communicate across dialect and regional language barriers used. In the early 20th century, you had Guoyu, neologism borrowed from Japanese, and that was coined to refer to the national language. Later, the communists say this is postwar as the standard, while in Taiwan, of course, it's still Guoyu today. There's also the vexing issue of fangyan, which is usually but problematically translated as dialect. These are not the only terms. There's Hanyu, there's Huaryu, right? But these are the ones that I will address today. Let me give you a quick overview of the narrative arc of the book. So I know some of the students in Emily's class were supposed to read the book. So this
They
part,
read it very closely.
but for everybody else, I'll just give you kind of the sort of bird's eye view. The book begins at the turn of the 20th century when there was a rising chorus advocating for linguistic unity, calling for the congruence of speech and writing. And this is modeled on Japan's Genbu Ichi movement. The Conference to Unify Pronunciation in 1913 crafted a blueprint for a standard national language, and it left behind this legacy of acrimony and disagreements. In the decade that followed, there was the debates extended to a tangled web of issues, including tonal differentiation, phonetic notation, and pedagogy. So what counted as standard Guoyu, and who gets to decide? And if you could actually decide, how would the new speech norms be taught or enforced? So the short version of the story is that it gets very messy, and 7 people would have like 10 different opinions. So they can't quite figure it out in this period. I'll return to this, so hold that thought. Then when Chiang Kai-shek unified the country under nationalist rule in 1928, the regime put the muscle of its state-building aspirations behind this effort to make the national language a reality. So they have blueprints, they have plans. The trick is, how do you actually get people to do this, right? So the government convened a preparatory committee for national language unification, and they got to work. They changed the name of the phonetic notation from zimu, from alphabet, to fuhao, to annotated symbols. And they actually, in 1932, published a new dictionary that set Beijing pronunciation as the standard. So seeing that some of the disputations of the past have been put to rest, right? There's a decision. But then new storms of controversy erupted. 3 competing systems. So there's Zhuyin, there's Guoyu Roma Zi, and then there's Ladinhua Xingwen Zi. That basically, they start to clash over not only script, but over pronunciation. And the relationship between the national and the local becomes very contested. Meanwhile, in film, radio, and the gramophone, there are these new channels for diffusing the sounds of the national language, particularly in urban settings. The introduction of sound cinema kindled this moment of hope that film could be the potent medium needed to unify the nation's speech. So the dictionaries, the educational initiatives had not really been able to do it, so everyone thought, oh, let's use film. That pedagogical promise could not really be sustained. It did not quite work out. The outbreak of the war against Japan in 1937, among the millions who joined the Kuomintang in retreat, were prominent intellectuals who had spearheaded the project of linguistic unification. So in this chapter, I chart the fate of the national language in exile during the war years. And to some people, they thought the war was going to be kind of a golden opportunity for the national language, right? There's a crisis, and it's going to infuse the cause with greater urgency than ever. You also have a lot of people on the move, and so out of necessity, people might actually, sign on to this project. In practice, however, the educational system was debilitated by underfunding and by all these wartime disruptions, and so it meant that if you were trying to use education as using the schools as the place to make the national language happen, that momentum really stalled out. There was never enough resources or sustained energy to carry through the aspiration for speech unification. In this chapter, I also venture to what they call the border regions, because these intellectuals and linguists went out to Kunming and Guizhou and all these places, and there they encountered people whose speech could not find really any stretch of the imagination, be considered Han dialects, right? So these are male people, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Mongolians. And so their attempts to reconcile what they call these special frontier languages with their vision of one nation speaking in one voice challenged some of the fundamental assumptions and priorities of their national language movement. From there, we move to Taiwan, the end of World War II. So Kuomintang officials arrive for the takeover. They find a population speaking to them gibberish, right? There's varieties of Minanhua and Hakka, and the educated adults and school children are speaking in Japanese, known as Kokugo. The birth of Goryeo on the mainland had coincided with this period of colonial rule almost exactly. And so at its conclusion, few Taiwanese had really any familiarity with the idea of a Chinese national language. So when the Kuomintang officials say, speak Goryeo, people spoke in Japanese, and they're furious about it, right? So the Kuomintang is determined to eradicate these vestiges of Japanese imperialism, and so what they want to do is to teach the people to speak the true national language and get rid of this imposter, right? And here I became very interested in this triangular competition between Japanese, the national language that the Kuomintang bring over, and the island's varied vernacular speech. I think I tried to rewrite the story of the Kuomintang's Mandarin-only policy by thinking about this triangular competition. And I'll just say as an aside that taking this detour to Taiwan turned out to be one of those serendipitous decisions that opened a portal to a new world. It's one chapter in the book, like all of them, they're kind of too long, but easily could have been 2 or 3 chapters, and could have been an entire book by itself. It's certainly a very rich subject that deserves a lot more attention. But I had to drag myself out of Taiwan, back to Mao Zedong in 1949, because I'm like, I still haven't gotten there, right? So while the Kuomintang was launching its linguistic project in Taiwan, the national language was concurrently reborn in 3 guises under socialism. So in the People's Republic, there's a trio of Putonghua, simplified characters, and pinyin phonetics. And together, this is supposed to wipe out the linguistic legacy of feudalism. In the domain of speech, there was a campaign that launched with fanfare in 1955. And so the last chapter looks at Putonghua as both a political project and social history. I wanted to understand the dynamics of how people learned or did not learn to speak the anointed standard of the socialist state. So now it's called the Common Language of New China. They have removed the nation from the name. So there's a different ideological commitment here, right? That's different than the language of the predecessor of Kuomintang. And lastly, just there's a very brief epilogue that kind of does a quick and dirty overview of the divergent fates of Goryeo and Putonghua in the 1980s and 1990s. So in Taiwan, the national language actually reached a nearly universal degree of penetration. But just as it did so, political liberalization opened the door for challenges to the perceived linguistic tyranny of an authoritarian regime. So they have been working towards creating a Goryeo environment, and they managed to pretty much do so. That Goryeo environment finally materializes, but a lot of people rose to reject both the language and its identification with China. Conversely, in the PRC, the legitimacy of Putonghua, the common language, with a standardized pronunciation, with lexicon and grammar that's standardized, shared across ethnic and social divides, was firmly consolidated, but it really still remained out of reach as social reality. And even today, it's not quite there, right? It's not quite as common as people want it to be. So that's the overview of the book. The main argument is that at the level of political ideology and rhetoric, it was beyond dispute that the national language could and should anchor Chinese unity against foreign imperialism and domestic sources of fracture. In practice, however, the practice of taking that ideological aspiration and making it into spoken reality proved messy and sometimes quite confused. So if the national language was an instrument of power for the modern state, my conclusion is that successive governments in China wielded this weapon somewhat clumsily. The Smoking Standard was a moving target, and speech proved more impervious to intervention than anticipated. To the consternation of many of its proponents, the people did not spontaneously embrace Guoyu. They had to be cajoled or prodded, reminded, compelled to learn it. And contrary to expectations, the superiority of Guoyu or Putonghua was not necessarily self-evident or universally shared. And they were always very disappointed by that. So what I'm going to do now is turn to two specific moments to illustrate how I develop some of these arguments in more detail. The first is the beginning of the story in the 1913 and into the 1920s, and the second is the 1955 Putonghua campaign. Okay, so taking it from the beginning, the most important precedent was the 1913 conference to unify pronunciation, convened by the Ministry of Education. Now, those of you who know Republican history know that this is a very weak government, but they still managed to do this. They get 80 delegates, invited them to Beijing, and they charged them with the task of determining a national pronunciation and choosing a phonetic notation. So other scholars have described the controversies of this conference in detail, bickering, devolving into name-calling, fistfights, more than 100 different phonetic notation systems put forward to consideration. So this conference went on for months. The chairman, Wu Zhihui, resigned after 2 months of contentious wrangling. He had it. Wang Zhao replaced him, but he only lasted for 2 weeks before he also quit. He said that he had chest pains, it was just too stressful. So then they tapped Wang Pu to take over, and he finally brought the proceedings to some kind of conclusion. So publicly they announced that there was going to be a system of national pronunciation, as reflected in about 6,500 characters, decided by majority vote. So they literally put a character up on the board and they said, how are we going to pronounce this? Northern speech formed the basis for most of the sounds, but because there were a bunch of Southerners there, they added prominent elements of Southern speech into this national pronunciation. Hence, it's the hybrid. There's a syllabary of 39 symbols that comprise the phonetic alphabet, the Zhuyin symbol. So the combative circumstances are pretty well known. In the long term, I think what's most interesting is that they pushed through this compromise and ended up, this conference intended to unify, ended up sowing the seeds of contestation for years to come. And even in the 1980s, people are still talking about what happened in 1913. So before we're not going to get to the 1980s, but the debates were really intense and heated between 1919 and 1921 because there's a kind of a long lag period, but the Ministry of Education decides to implement these new curriculum mandates to teach the national language, both written and spoken. And this goes to the primary schools. So what had primarily been arguments, name-calling among these experts, now moved into schools and classrooms. So what sounds should constitute the standard for the national pronunciation? How many tones should it have? How should the phonetic alphabet, this Zhuyin symbol, be used pedagogically? Should Guoyu be the exclusive medium of instruction for primary schools? How can students learn the national language if their teachers don't know how to speak it, right? So each of these questions provoked a series of battles over the what and the how. So what is the national language, and how should it be taught? The standard was still a work in progress, and this created a lot of frustration for the educators, right? And so they're griping really loudly at this juncture about the absurdity of telling them to implement these linguistic norms that were still moving around. In 1920, the Ministry of Education issued this directive mandating that classical language classes, Guowen, be replaced by the written vernacular. So these new textbooks could be rewritten with relative ease, not without controversy, but if you have control over publishing, you can actually do it. There was not yet a consensus among the experts about the normative features of the spoken national language, though, much less a definitive standard coming from a central authority. So for much of the early 1920s, the National Language Preparatory Committee had deliberated and argued over all of these issues. So they added to the Zhuyin symbol a 40th phoneme, so they went from 39 to 40. They approved a motion that soft-pedaled the issue of tonal differentiation. They said, in teaching the national pronunciation, it is not necessary to adhere to the tones. So this was one of the most interesting debates of this time. How many tones should the national pronunciation have? The 1913 conference had actually said 5. There were a lot of people who went to the mat and said it's 4, like it's 4, no question. And then there were a lot of others, including prominent figures like Li Jingxi and Chen Xuntong, who said, yeah, we don't need a set number. Chen, for instance, said tonal differentiation was completely impossible and completely unnecessary. He said that speech has its own natural tones, so if you're speaking Guoyu in Guangdong, use your 9 tones. In Zhejiang, use 7, right, and so on. The first time I read this, I was flabbergasted at the crazy talk. How can you speak Guoyu with 7 or 9 tones? To say the tones are unnecessary is pretty close to linguistic heresy, right? Now, because of examples like this, and there were a lot of them, I became interested in the instability of the standard and the vigorous debates that this process of trying to standardize provoked. What we take as linguistic gospel today was not set in stone at the outset. Creating the standard was a decades-long process and quite a contentious one. So even more vexing and also unresolved was the question of the relationship between dialect or local pronunciation and the national one. So for some, it was pretty obvious that at a minimum, if you are an instructor teaching Guoyu, you should speak Guoyu, right? It's a pretty low bar. But others disagreed, and they said, well, what harm could there be to use the local pronunciation when you are reading national language textbooks? So it's a good question, right? What harm would be caused by this mixture of Fangyan and Guoyu? For the purists, the answer was, it's a lot of harm, right? This is major damage, and it's an adulteration of the National Language Project. The whole point was linguistic unification, right? But for others who prioritize mass literacy, they felt that unified speech could wait. It was more important to teach people how to read. In the 1920s and 1930s, this debate turned out to be inconclusive. Not everyone agreed that it should be a priority to teach people to speak the national language, and the mechanisms for teaching were inconsistent. They could not compel the teachers to do so, much less the rest of the population. Any changes that were implemented in schools were done at the initiative of individuals. So you would find some of these people who really kind of sign on to the project, whether they're principals or they're committed teachers. And sometimes when they did this, parents would get really mad at them and say, you know, what are you doing? Please stop. In the absence of comprehensive statistics, it's not possible to gauge precisely the degree of Guoyu penetration across the country, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence, and I think it's quite convincing on this point, which is that from the 1920s through the 1950s, most schools really did not have teachers able to use Guoyu and later Putonghua as the medium of instruction. And so they would have these directives that said, at a minimum, each school should have the language teacher learn Guoyu or Putonghua, and the subject teachers, like if you're teaching math or chemistry, you'd be like, okay, nothing to do with me, right? And to be able to get this into the educational system across the country is a monument, it's a colossal task. Teacher training was a recurring problem, and to solve it would have required massive resources, resources that no government in the early and mid-20th century was willing to spend on this particular issue. So under the Kuomintang government, teacher training did receive sporadic attention. In 1930, the Education Ministry issued an order that for the first time, added the spoken component explicitly to the existing mandates for national language directives. So they were pretty clear about this thing. So, you know, in the past, we really didn't mention the language that the teacher should use as the medium of instruction. We really focused on the written. The pedagogy of the national language requires both the written vernacular and the use of Korean as the medium of instruction, so that there will be this convergence between what you hear and what you read. And for this reason, it is decreed. This is a really interesting word. They're decreeing that all middle and primary school teachers, within the scope of what is possible, should use the language that approximates standard Korean. So it doesn't even have to be standard, it's just like close enough. And use it as the language of instruction. And there's a lot of other language about, okay, if you're not already proficient, you should practice. But what if you can't or don't want to? They don't really say anything about that, but they do scold those teachers who have what they say are erroneous assumptions and use them as excuses. So people say, oh, I have to use dialect to teach because otherwise the students won't understand. Some are refusing to do it because they're embarrassed. So they say, this is the right attitude. Quote, if you avoid speaking because of embarrassment, how will you improve in the future? So this directive was sent around the country. I found copies actually archived in a lot of different municipalities, but very little evidence of how it was actually implemented. So the effects are unclear, most likely uneven. This is a prescribed course of action, but no mandate despite the decree, because there's this giant loophole, right, within the scope of what is possible. So you say, oh, it's not possible. This problem of enforcement went beyond education. Many people said government ministries should set the example, but there was likewise no enforcement mechanism there. The National Language Preparatory Committee complained that, except for the top ministries, government offices were still using the classical language in their written communications. So the allegation was that both the written and spoken forms of the national language had not gained traction in these crucial institutional settings. Even more egregious was the situation of senior government officials who, quote, do not know the national language. So the foreign minister and his deputy were called out as Cantonese speakers, notorious for garbling their poetry. How could they represent the nation, right? Quote, wouldn't we be the laughingstock of the world if other countries discovered this? There was a suggestion that the Kuomintang Party platform should be amended to disqualify those who do not know the national language from serving as officials. Now, the Kuomintang do not actually stipulate linguistic competence as a qualification for holding office because of this guy, Chen, right? So, thick Zhejiang garble probably would not pass a Boryu proficiency test. And so instead, they say, well, let's go to the bottom rung of the government bureaucracy, and let's start there. So there's a national directive in 1930 that told provincial and local jurisdictions that they would be responsible for ensuring Zhuyin proficiency among government workers and teachers, and to do it within 4 months. And after that period, if you did not comply, these would be handled as cases of dereliction of duty. They also said that starting in 1931, preference for hiring for government positions or teachers would actually be given to those who could actually demonstrate that they have proficiency in Zhuyin. And I did find some of these letters that people sent to apply for government jobs, and they actually wrote them in Zhuyin to show that they had his proficiency. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But I did not actually find any cases of government workers or teachers who were charged or fired, for dereliction of duty because they had not attained this proficiency. Now, it's dubious whether anyone who could pass this Zhuyin test was necessarily proficient in speaking the national language, right? And this would be a recurring theme through the 1930s and 40s. Complaints about the conflation of these symbols and the national language. Someone could memorize the syllabary, but actually not really be able to speak Warrior, right? And so the effectiveness of this kind of proficiency test was, I think, an open question. All right, so I could go on about this, but let's skip ahead to 1955 and 1956. This is the crucial moment when the inaugural 普通话 campaign was launched. So in the winter of 1955 and into the spring of 1956, a series of articles appeared in national publications with this exhortation. Please don't laugh at people who are trying to learn 普通话. So behind the headlines, there were a lot of these different permutations. This one talks about the erroneous attitude of mocking people, right? Different, sort of same refrain, different permutations, and different discussion forms. This was at the very beginning of this campaign to popularize the common language. And so I thought this was kind of curious, right? What were people laughing at and why? What was so comical about learning the language that the government had recently declared to be the spoken standard? So a few months earlier, in October 1955, the Committee for Language Reform had this big conference, a very important script reform conference, and they defined the normative properties of 普通话 as a common language with Beijing pronunciation as the standard. And then the State Council actually followed up with a expanded definition, and this is what they said. The foundation for the unification of Hanyu already exists. 普通话 that sets Beijing pronunciation as the standard, Northern vernacular as the base dialect. Everybody gets really confused about what this base dialect is, but even so. And then you have exemplary modern vernacular works as the grammatical norm. So school teachers and students, soldiers, workers, policemen, journalists, translators, and actors were the major occupational groups instructed to gradually learn 普通话 and contribute to the goal of standardized speech through their jobs. Simultaneously, the propaganda machine pumps out this steady stream of messages, reiterating that everyone should try their best, do their utmost to promote the common language. So in this context, it seemed odd to me at least that there would be these persistent references to laughter and mockery. So where did this come from and what did they mean, and how did party cadres and leaders of the campaign diagnose the problem, and what do they do about this, right? How do you stop people from laughing, right? So for starters, since this was to be a mass campaign, the first thing they have to do is explain what 普通话 is. This official definition was repeated ad nauseum, but for a lot of people, like, it's kind of gobbledygook, right? What does this actually mean when you say, okay, this is 普通话, speak it? So people had a lot of questions. And the first question was, is 普通话 the same as Beijing Hua, right? What's the difference? And then there are people who remember the national language of the days of the Kuomintang. Maybe they had learned it, and a lot of people know about the old Guanhua. And so they asked, is 普通话 the new name for what we had learned before? Is it the same thing? If not, what's the difference? Then, what is the meaning of 普通 in 普通话? What does common mean in this? And does it mean common in the sense of something that's ordinary, everyday, the opposite of refined? This is confusing, and so the party cadres repeatedly said, don't treat it as something that's ordinary or commonplace. What we mean is that it's collective and shared uses. That's what 普通 means. And finally, there were many questions about the relationship between 普通话 and dialects. This is mean that we are not allowed to speak dialect anymore. This is a big source of anxiety for people. So for the cadres responsible for this campaign, these questions, all these objections from the people were indications of widespread misunderstanding and pointed to the work that they were going to have to do to explain, educate, to correct their misperceptions. They saw this mountain of ideological problems that could derail the campaign. So for example, the linguistics professor Wang Li gave a speech at the October Reform Conference. So some of you probably know him from a dictionary that you own. I think if you look on your bookshelf, you probably have that dictionary. So this is what Wang said at the conference. He said, many people are afraid of learning 普通话, especially those whose native speech diverges a lot from the pronunciation of the new standard. They think that 普通话 is too difficult, and they are afraid of other people's mockery if they do not learn it well. So there's a saying, we are not afraid of heaven or earth, we're only afraid of right? So we've actually all heard this. There's a lot of variations on this that people still say today. People say, oh, Mandarin or Sounds of Mandarin, right? It's really interesting that in 1955, Wang Li uses guanhua as the term. And so he said, listen, this kind of mocking attitude, we need to change this. I suggest that we turn mockery into encouragement. We should say instead, we're not afraid of heaven or earth. We're surely not afraid of Taiwan, right? The Chinese people do not fear difficulty. We destroyed 800 million troops in Chiang Kai-shek's bandit game. How could we not conquer this linguistic fortress, right? So that linguistic fortress turned out to be more impregnable than he had expected. So subsequent publicity referred repeatedly to laughing and mockery lurking in society. And the People's Daily specifically addressed the perception in this article down here of that Putonghua was intended to destroy or replace local dialects. Not true, quote, dialects may and certainly will coexist with Putonghua for quite a long period of time. The campaign is only going to expand the scope of use for the standard while working gradually to reduce the boundaries of use for dialects. So we're going to try to shift the balance here, and it was imperative to change, to correct this narrow concept of narrow localism, and that narrow localism, according to the People's Daily, manifests itself as, quote, refusing to acknowledge Putonghua, unwilling to listen to it, and even to the extent of forbidding your children to speak Putonghua. So this is all at the very beginning stage of the campaign, and there was already this anticipation of the problems, right? That some people were treated with mockery or refusal. But how many people did they think were like this, right? Was it the majority? Was it a vocal minority? A few malcontents and bad apples causing trouble? Unfortunately, there's not really a precise way to, or really any way to gauge this, because the sources, as far as I've been able to find, basically like to attribute the problem to some people. So it's 有些人, 有些人. And judging from the recurring discussions, there weren't enough of these people to cause real alarm, but like we can't really count them. The education minister, Zhang Xiro, said in 1955, some people don't understand the issues and ask, what does speech have to do with politics? Some people are maybe willing, but they hesitate. So they say things like, learning Putonghua is good and all, but it's very difficult, and I'm too old. Some people fret that while they're learning, they would be ridiculed as tossing around a Beijing accent, so putting on airs. And so the education minister counseled patience, perseverance. Quote, we cannot expect to learn it all in one go, or to achieve 100% accuracy immediately. In the process of learning, you should not be afraid of other people's mockery. Learning Putonghua is our highest obligation, so why laugh? We say that those who ought to be criticized and disparaged are not the people learning Putonghua, but the ones who are unwilling to learn, who are clinging for dear life to their own dialects and won't let go. So among the scoffers, there were a lot of different possible sources for their disdain. So according to one analysis, there was one group, those who are actually able to speak relatively fluently, and they look down on the others for their mispronunciation, thinking, aren't you embarrassed? So that's where some of the mockery and laughter comes from. But there's a second group, those unable to speak Putonghua, who laugh at those who are trying to learn, and they assert the purity of their own incompetence. They say things like, quote, I do not know how to speak, and so I don't. That's the honest way to go. Not like you, posing as an expert with your bad pronunciation. So they saw themselves as kind of like heroes in this, and they proudly advertised their incompetence. And by doing so, they're affirming, according to this analysis, a preference for their native dialect. So there's other commentators who assess the substance of these dissenting opinions in even greater detail. So here's one version that listed 7 different attitudes. I'm not going to read them all, but there's kind of a cluster of anxieties around acts of articulation that are perceived to be awkward or too difficult. So lack of talent or confidence, I'm too old, so a lot of it, I'm too old. These were either reasons or excuses for not learning. The first one could be glossed either as an innocent remark or as a belligerent one, right? Depending on the inflection of how you say it, it could be, oh, why do I need to learn Putonghua? I don't know how. Or it could be indifference, or it could actually have a note of antagonism. And so different people would, different analysts who are looking at the situation would gloss these comments in different ways. And finally, there is, of course, a fear of laughter. That contributed to a lot of unease about the new speech norms. So in the book, I probably spend too much time working through these kinds of different reactions and the different permutations of laughter, thinking about how or in what ways laughing either reinforced or undermined the putative prestige language. There was one repeated rendering that pointed to how speaking Putonghua could subject the speaker to ridicule for sounding foolish, or according to one nebulous saying, it sounds bad, 不好听 or 难听. So this kind of laughter, I think, could have the effect of reinforcing the status of the prestige language, right? So if you have someone who's taunting a classmate for not speaking Putonghua well, if you have someone who's worried about becoming the butt of jokes because of inaccurate pronunciation, I think those views implicitly reinforce the standard. There is a standard, you just can't, you can't get there. But in other contexts, there's laughter that could signal, I think, a denial of the claim to higher status. So when people said straight up, Putonghua is useless, or they say, we don't like how it sounds, students laughed at teachers for bumbling through their lessons or speaking Putonghua in a garbled manner. One primary school teacher explained that students who are unaccustomed to the sound often start laughing when they hear it. So she would call on a student to read aloud from the textbook. It's a strange voice and odd manner, and the class basically sets off in roaring and hilarity. It becomes a big joke, right? And then there was this particular strand of mockery that singled out those trying to speak Putonghua for putting on airs, for imitating party cadres. And in this variation, Putonghua actually marks the speaker as an outsider. So I'm going to give you a specific example of this. This was an anecdote featured in a local education journal. So in this story, Wang Laoshi, teacher Wang, has completed a 1-month Putonghua training course. When he returns, he sees a colleague, Xing Laoshi, and he greets him warmly. And this is what the story says, quote, "So strange, teacher Xing did not reply. He opened his eyes wide, looked teacher Wang over from head to toe. After a moment's silence, Xing said, I haven't seen you for a while. How come your accent has changed? Seems like you are no longer a local." So everyone around burst out laughing. And someone else said, he's not a local, but also not a foreigner. And they all stared at him, this teacher Wang, who felt embarrassed. So in this narrative, the teacher has a newly acquired Putonghua accent that subjected him to these jokes from his colleagues. Ranges from good-natured, kind of poking, fun, to a little bit of scorn. But instead of rising in status in the community, he becomes an outsider, right? He's not as alien as a foreigner, but so he's not an outcast, but he's no longer sort of one of us, right? And so the moral of the story praises this teacher Wang for trying and admonishes those who make fun of him, but I think the social dynamics are quite revealing. Here's another example. In a sharper vein, another observer said there are four types of people with ideological problems related to Putonghua: unequivocally opposed, vacillators, the conceited and apathetic, and the wait-and-seers. Quote, "Some people say this thing, Putonghua, can never work because language is a matter of people's freedom. There's no way you can force people to speak a prescribed language." So this is pretty interesting. I'd be curious to know from those who work more closely with PRC sources what you think the notion of freedom invoked here actually means. But for the rest of the 1950s, this comment, there's no way you can force people to speak a prescribed language, turned out to be more true than expected. All right, so the story continues. I don't have time to go through the rest of it, kind of blow by blow, but in brief, there was a great leap moment when the winds of exaggeration billowed to claims that perfect speech unity could be achieved within days or weeks. And so there were these groups that said, we're going to do it in 7 days. No, we're going to do it in 10. Obviously they don't. In the early 1960s, there's a funny anecdote involving Lei Feng. This is the iconic soldier who could not actually speak Putonghua. And I end with one telling example from 1966, Chen, one of the leaders of the Cultural Revolution, who goes around the country giving speeches to Red Guard groups. And the transcripts begin with him apologizing for not speaking Putonghua very well, and he says, let me get an interpreter. But no one laughed. Okay, so I've been talking for nearly an hour, which is undoubtedly trying your patience. So I'm going to stop. Look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.